Hello, George Fragopoulos, and hello, everybody else. It's Liam. Welcome to the first ever episode of a show that I'm tentatively calling Message to a Buster, which is a fun little new segment that we're going to try, where instead of talking on the phone or talking via Skype, I record a message, send it to George, and he sends a response, and that becomes an episode. And we thought, what better thing to start with than a new Batman comic that came out this week that you might have heard about. It's called Batman: The Adventures Continue, and it is a new take on the Batman the Animated Series. But excitingly, it was written by Alan Burnett and Paul Dini, who played a major role in the original Batman the Animated Series. And the first issue's been out about a week. The second issue will come out next week. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, and I would offer some thoughts to George, and he could respond. The first issue is called Hardware Part 1. And it begins with Batman taking down Bane, who he has given some kind of tranquilizer to. It's a very, very quick opening. The art for the opening of this and for the entire issue, it looks a lot like the original Batman the Animated Series art, which is it's kind of nice to return to that, and it does feel really quite crisp. There's a little more detail in it than there was maybe in the original show because of the static nature of the images, but they're really good. And the beginning is fun. It's kind of a throwback to the way we've always thought of Bane as kind of a meat-headed character until Nolan turned him into a philosophical, I don't even know how to describe it. So he takes down Bane and thinks his night is over, but a robot attacks Wayne Enterprises. And Batman tries to stop this robot, but is unable to. And the robot makes off with some kind of energy device, which we later find out in a scene with Alfred, which, guys, no one told me Alfred died in the comic books. I was reading a review of this issue, and they were saying that that Alfred died in the regular run of the show, which I didn't know that, but they were saying it's good to have him back in this. So Alfred died, didn't know. But it turns out it's a piece of alien hardware that has been stolen by this robot that Superman brought to Wayne Enterprises, brought to Batman. And they're trying to figure out what it was. This leads to a scene where Bruce Wayne attends a cocktail party at a place called the Cloud9. There's a nice little bit where Alfred talks about the suit he's going to wear, which is a merino wool and cashmere jacket with a subtle blue stripe, which sounds nice. Bruce Wayne goes to this party. He is approached by a woman named Veronica, with whom he has a former entanglement, and she and he are then interrupted by Lex Luthor. So this is a good time to pause and talk about how this series isn't just relying on apparently it's not relying on the original characters, and it is more kind of expanding outside the reign of the original Batman the Animated Series. So Jason Todd, who is the Red Hood, I believe, in the comic books, shows up in this episode, and it's very surprising to see Lex Luthor looking much like he does on the animated universe. He shows up later in the issue, and he and Bruce have a millionaire tete-a-tete. I like these scenes. I like the early scenes with the robot quite a bit, but I have to say my favorite stuff in comic books are dialogue scenes, because I find comic book action stuff to just not be as interesting as the moving image. But I like this bit because it's sort of a millionaire tete-a-tete, and Luthor mentions that he hasn't been able to be in touch with Superman. Superman has had a fight on the far side of the moon, and we never find out what that's about, at least in this issue. But it's kind of an interesting moment. It's also kind of, I like that sometimes these comics play with the tension of Lex Luthor and Superman. I think that's kind of fun. But yeah, there's a nice little tete-a-tete. They go back and forth. Bruce Wayne is unable to reach Clark Kent. So instead he goes to investigate an airfield where he believes is a good spot for someone to hide a giant robot with a stolen vault. He goes there, he takes out a guard, and he finds the robot, he finds the vault, and he is attacked by a mysterious figure who ends up being Lex Luthor in some kind of superhero suit. I kind of remember this suit from the action figure I had as a kid. And it ends with Batman in the clutches of Luthor. And issue 2 is called In the Clutches of Luthor. I thought this was I would give this like a 3.5, 3 out of 5 start for the series. I liked that we got Bruce Wayne the Bachelor for a moment. I liked that it begins with action. I like that Bane shows up. I read it twice, and I don't know. Sometimes I like to read long stretches of comic book in one go. I sometimes feel like I read a comic and I'm like, that's it? Okay. But I'm going to keep reading this. It hits on some of the classic Batman stuff, like Bruce the Bachelor, his sort of slightly antagonistic relationship with Alfred. And it was cool to see Lex Luthor and Jason Todd show up. And I'm curious to see where they go with all of that. 3 stars, 3 out of 5, pretty good. Gonna read the second issue. And it's nice to be able to revisit the Batman the Animated Series in a new kind of exciting way that we can go week to week with. It's a really rich area, and it makes me want to go back and watch the show. Okay, that's it. George, love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure you'll find it reactionary. Bye.
Liam Bellingham. How's it going? This is day 725 of quarantine. I'm not really sure what's happening outside, as I've not left my apartment in a couple of years. And yeah, there might be something resembling human civilization outside my front door, but until I step outside and check, I can't tell. But what I do know is that I did read this comic. So again, this is my response to you asking me to read this, The New Adventures of Batman, or Batman The New Adventures, whatever it's called, and sending you a brief response. And this is that response. So I kind of sent you a somewhat facetious, somewhat flirtatious, if you don't mind me saying, text message saying that this comic book kind of confused me, and I stick by that. And everybody, by the way, should listen to Liam's response first, because he does an excellent job of kind of quickly going over the plot. But what I meant by that was, reading this, my first kind of question was, why this comic book now? In other words, why return to the aesthetic of the animated series and do as such through the lens of the comic? Now, from my understanding is that there was another kind of spin-off Batman title back in maybe the 90s, or one that coincided, I guess, more synchronously or contemporaneously with the animated series. So that kind of made sense. And it's also kind of made sense to me because when I was reading comics way back in the day, not to date myself, but there seemed to be more of an industry to it. There seemed to be more of a kind of, well, at least from my understanding of it, that it used to be big bucks, and that recently that's become less and less of a thing. So that, for example, the commodification of comic book intellectual properties is now kind of obviously turning everything into films or TV shows, and that's where the big money is, and then nobody reads comics as they did, let's say, 25 years ago. I could, of course, be wrong about that. I'm not saying nobody reads it. Obviously, there's still a market, but that there was a huge contraction of that market, maybe like in the late 90s, early aughts. And again, I could be talking out of my ass, but I would really love to hear people comment on that. So one thing, for example, that I had in mind is that there used to be, like, for example, with Batman, like 4 or 5 or 6 Batman titles running at one time. And from my understanding, I think that kind of multiplicity of titles has slowed down. So reading this, I was like, this is kind of interesting, because obviously it's more cheaper and it's easier to produce a comic than it is a single episode of a new animated series. But I was like, why the nostalgia for it? And by the way, it did make me feel nostalgic. Reading this was a bit of fun. It did get me away from thinking about civilizational collapse for about 10 minutes. So that was good. It felt a little bit like a warm hug. Returning to young George Fragopoulos, maybe being 10 or 11, watching the animated series and absolutely loving it. It also reminded me of how we did that episode of the animated series about a year ago. Or not a year ago. What am I saying? Back in December. My God, December feels so fucking far away. But when we did that episode about with Christmas with the Joker, and I was like, this is not very good. This is just kind of somewhat obnoxious. And maybe it was the episode. Maybe it was me at that moment. But yeah. So returning to this and reading this, I was like, why this comic book now? And I don't have an answer to that question, by the way. I'm just really curious about it. The other weird aesthetic choices or decision, and I think there are multiple in this. So for example, the use of Bane in the first 2 or 3 panels, and like that's it. So he appears and then he quickly disappears. And I'm not saying that, I mean, I don't fucking care. I'm not beholden to a certain kind of image of the character that has to be upheld, but it just seemed really weird to like introduce him and then just as quickly remove him from the storyline. And maybe he'll come back later. I don't know, but it just seemed like a really weird decision. The decision to have a robot as, I guess, the main villain was kind of cool, at least for this issue. And it did have this kind of like retro 1950s robot feel to it. And that I was digging. I was like, I really like the artwork. I really like how angular it is, how noirish it is. That really kind of drew me in. But the Luthor stuff also was just kind of, again, weird. I'm assuming it's setting up a Superman visit later on in the series. But I was like, that's kind of an interesting choice. And maybe, again, it's like you said, it's supposed to kind of some sort of way bring up issues regarding billionaire conflict. Maybe, perhaps. I don't really know if this series is going to say anything interesting about class warfare or class consciousness. It might. But I'm not going to use the R word that Liam wants me to use to describe this. But I am curious to see what it might do with the tension between Luthor and Batman. Sure, I'm following that. But again, it just seemed a little bit weird to me. Liam seemed to suggest that you see Jason Todd very briefly, or that Jason Todd is in this, and he is maybe for a panel. I don't know if it was Jason Todd or is it Dick Grayson? Is it Robin? It's one of the Robins, maybe. So does this take place also in a universe where there isn't a Robin yet, or we're transitioning from one Robin to another? I don't know. I'm confused. Alfred's in this. He mispronounces Cosa Nostra as Costa Nostra, which, regrettable typo. The DC editors missed one. And yeah, as Liam said, the part that works probably best is the tete-a-tete between him and Luthor. I didn't mind, actually, the action sequences, and I don't think Liam did either, but they were fun. Yeah, again, the artwork was interesting. It was really cool to look at. It was really vibrant. I read it on my MacBook, so the colors were really vibrant. Yeah, again, it was just kind of, it felt like a return or kind of, it was saturated with a lot of nostalgia for me reading this. But again, that didn't necessarily make me in any sort of way, I think, maybe really value this or think that it was good. Sorry, that sounds really dismissive. But it was definitely fun. I think I might read another issue, especially if Liam is down for reading another issue. And yeah, those are my feelings. So again, I was a little bit confused. Or maybe I was a lot of confused. I would have loved to potentially hear from some of our fans, perhaps via angry tweets or hate mail, about some of the things that I said in regards to the comic book industry and about, let's say, the contraction of it or the contraction of the amount of publications that were coming out, again, in the like mid to late 90s into the early aughts, and about where the industry might actually stand now, and perhaps a relationship, again, between the printed material, which, again, is becoming more and more, obviously, not the standard, because I'm assuming more of these things are now being read on tablets and on computer screens or on phones than ever before, and that you're more likely, I think, to read them in that way than you would by just going out to a comic book store and buying a actual physical comic book. So I think I'm just really kind of curious about, I guess, about the state of the industry. and about what this particular comic might say about that, if anything. Maybe I'm just talking out of my ass. Again, I've been indoors for so fucking long, as we all have. So thank you for listening, Liam. Sending my love across the continent, and talk to you soon. All right, bye.